So I think we're going to start off with some maps. Then we'll go to the timeline, and then hopefully we'll loop around to what we didn't quite get to on Monday, and everything will work out. As of next Monday, we're actually starting to read the Bible, right? And starting to march our way through the Hebrew Scriptures. Enough introductions. Let's start with some maps. I gave you a short list of places that I expect you to know where they are, not because I'm being difficult or unreasonable, but because these places will come up hundreds of times in the next 12 weeks, so maybe you should know where they are. Right. So we have a bunch of maps on the course page, and there's a few features I just wanted to bring to your attention so we know where we are, what part of the world we're in. Okay, so here's a general map of the land of Canaan. So here is the land that nowadays is called Israel. Parts of it are called by some people Palestine. It was also once called the land of Canaan, the land of the Canaanites that was then conquered by the Israelites. The phrase land of Israel, amazingly enough, recurs only twice in Scripture from America. So the land of Israel, amazingly enough, is not a common biblical locution. And the Bible is not obsessed about what you call this. Well, let's call it the land of Israel for the sake of convenience. Now, for our purposes, there are a bunch of features that we need to pay attention to, because these will be important in our later discussion. Okay, so here. All along the coast is the plain. See, it's called Plain of Philistia, Plain of Sharon. I'm not worried about those names, right? You have the Mediterranean, you have coastal lowlands. Coastal lowlands. This, you know, if you've ever been to Israel, you fly into Ben Gurion Airport, and like most airports, everything around you is flat. They don't build airports on mountaintops, right? Everything around you is flat because you're right here in the coastal lowlands. Approximately over here is where Ben Gurion Airport is. Right, as you travel inland, the topography gets like this, a little roly-poly, and then all of a sudden you are climbing. You have hills. I wouldn't call them mountains. These are hills. These are steep, steep hills. And these hills run the shank of the entire country, from top to bottom. Right? These are the hills. Down south, they're called the Judean Hills because they're in the district of Judah or Judea. We might be up here in Samaria. Here in Samaria. But we have here, you can see topography, a line of hills. These are the central highlands. For historians, what's important is that what we call the people of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, the group that emerges with that identity, seems to be a group or collection of groups that emerge particularly in the highlands, not in the lowlands. The lowlands were occupied, even the Bible itself tells us, especially down south, over here. This is where the Philistines are, roughly where the Gaza Strip is today. This is the area of the Philistines. Philistines were arch enemies of the Israelites. The Philistines were not circumcised. The Israelites were circumcised. The Philistines were experts in iron, metallurgy. The Israelites were not. So there's a culture clash as well as a military clash. The Philistines have tanks, and the Israelites don't. So this is not the strong point of the Israelites. The strong point of the Israelites are in the highlands. And the highlands go from north to south. You have Galilee up here, Galilee, Samaria, and then Judah, running from north to south. Galilee, Samaria, Galilee. Here you see Samaria, which is also the name of a city, as well as the name of a region. And then Judah. Capital of Judah, or Judea, is Jerusalem. Here it says Idumea. Don't worry about that. That's later. Okay, now we'll keep traveling. We've gone inland from the coastal plain up into the highlands. Again, if you take the bus from the airport to Jerusalem, you know at a certain point you're really going up and down. By the time you get to Jerusalem, you really are up in the hills. In fact, you can't walk in Jerusalem more than, a few feet, it seems, without either walking up or down a hill. That's simply the topography. Then you keep going. Then we have a crash down. If you've ever gone from Jerusalem, let's say to Jericho, or from Jerusalem to Qumran, or Jerusalem to Masada, what you've done is you traveled from here down to here. Here's Jericho over here. Here's En Gedi. So Masada is like over here. You've gone down. This, in fact, is the Dead Sea here. Here's the Jordan River. Here's the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Kinneret. Here, this is the lowest spot on the face of the planet. Right? Part of the African-Syrian rift, right? The major geological fault zone. Here you are plummeted down into what I said is the lowest spot on the face of the earth. Lowest in terms of feet below sea level. Below sea level. So you have here a tremendous diversity of topography. You know, it's a small country. This whole country is roughly the size of the state of New Jersey, and throw in Delaware, right? So we're talking here about something from an American perspective is tiny. It's tiny, right? And yet within that you have a tremendous variation in topography, both from north to south, and most particularly from west to east. Okay, what's that chart of depth elevations? Yes, that's the one. Right, so here you can see it. This is one way to look at it. Here you have the Mediterranean over here. Here's the Dead Sea there, 1,302 feet below sea level. Here you have the Mount of Olives, which is just outside Jerusalem, of 2,660 feet above sea level. Right? The distances are not very great, and yet the variations are tremendous. This means if you're not driving in a car, and most of the people in antiquity were not driving cars, then distances are short, and yet they're still very long, because the travel is slow. Travel is very slow, right, up and down these very steep hills. This creates regions that are barriers. Different districts are right near each other, but to get there is a major effort. Consequently, you're more or less located where you are. You're not going anywhere. For us modern people, that's a hard concept. There's another topography map. Can we get that one too? There. Here it's even more dramatic, you can see. So here are the highlands, the central highlands. Here are the lowlands over here, the plain, coastal plain. Here's the Mediterranean, right? And here you plummet down. Here's Jericho, 800 feet below sea level, and Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level. The key geopolitical fact to remember, which is still relevant today, is that this land, the land of Israel, is the land bridge between Egypt, or Africa, and Asia. Most of this area here is desert. Still is. This area is desert. This is what we call Jordan, Iraq, parts of it are Syria. This is desert. Consequently, the land bridge is relatively narrow. If you have armies expanding or marching, empires expanding from either the direction of Egypt or the direction of Asia, especially Mesopotamia, the area of the two rivers, here's Babylon, modern-day Iraq, you're going to become marching through this piece of territory because there's no other way to do it. So armies are marching up and down through the land of Israel over the millennia thousands of times as Egypt is expanding northward or as Mesopotamian empires are trying to expand southward. That's why the Bible is full of invading armies and invading empires. Right? Because Israel does not have the advantage of off on an island somewhere. On the contrary, it's at a main junction by an accident of geography. So here's the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire is the one that destroyed the Jerusalem temple in what year? 587. Wow, excellent. Right, 587. Or if you have an older textbook, it says 586, but it means the same thing. 587 BCE, Jerusalem is destroyed. The Israelites or Judeans are exiled from here to Babylon. Okay, now what's Babylon doing over here? Answer, it's called imperialism, right? Empires are expanding. So, if you are a Judean or an Israelite, and you know that empires are coming from this direction and coming to get you, where do you look for help? Egypt. Because Egypt is the obvious ally. If you want protection from this direction, you look in this direction, you go to Egypt. If you want protection from Egypt, you will look in that direction and look at the other empires. So the Bible is full of stories in which different kings of Judah or the northern kingdom are trying to make up allies, either with Arameans who are over here in Syria against the Babylonians or against the Egyptians, or with the Egyptians against the Babylonians, right? Because their options are very limited. And the geopolitical realities more or less dictate what your options are. And it still does. But that's a commentary on the Middle East, right? that Israel has to play off Egypt against Syria. Still does. But empires. We're going to mention in class a number of times the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire. Right. So remember, we have a period called the United Monarchy, where David and Solomon are the kings of, well, a united monarchy, right, in which all the tribes are together under the rule of David and then his son Solomon. Whether that's true or not true, historical, fictional, utopian, wishful thinking, that's another question. But that's what the Bible text says. So we call that the United Monarchy. After Solomon, the monarchy splits. So you have a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Okay, the northern kingdom is this one, the kingdom of Israel, sometimes called the kingdom of Ephraim, or the 10 tribes. Right, and then we have the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. Excuse me. The district, amazingly enough, is still called the district of Judah, or Judea. That's over here. All right, here's Samaria. Okay, so just to talk about contemporary Middle East for a second. Right, this part of the world, nowadays, some people call it occupied Palestine. Other people call it Samaria and Judea. It's the same place. It depends on what political value you want to assign to it. Okay, it's Judea. There's Samaria right there. That's the city of Samaria, and then the district of Samaria is here. The northern kingdom was on this side of the Jordan and also spilled over on the other side of the Jordan. The details of the map don't worry about because they're very uncertain. The important point is you recognize the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom, this one headquartered in Judea, Jerusalem, that one headquartered north of it in Samaria. If you got that, then you got a key geopolitical fact. Okay, which is this one. This is the Assyrian Empire. So who are the Assyrian empires? These are all baddies, right, from a biblical point of view. Foreign invading armies. Imperialists, that's what they are. Colonialists, that's what they are. So one empire is the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire reaches its heyday in the 8th century BCE and the first part to the 7th century BCE, 700s and 600s BCE. It falls at the end of the 7th century. But here in its height, we have here the Assyrian Empire about 721, right? When at its most aggressive and most expansive. The Assyrian Empire brings to an end the northern kingdom. After David and Solomon, the kingdom splits, north-south. The northern kingdom comes to an end by the hands of the Assyrians in 721 BCE. Okay, 721. So here is the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire is another one of those Mesopotamian empires. So it comes out of what modern-day Iraq. And Assyria is up in northern Iraq. Here is Ashur, Nineveh. These are the big cities of Assyria. Okay, the Assyrian Empire expands from here to there, conquering the northern kingdom and coming very close to conquering the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, which somehow escapes by the skin of its teeth. But it does escape. That's the Assyrian Empire. Next, Babylonians. Here is the Babylonian Empire, another Mesopotamian empire. This one from southern Mesopotamia. The Assyrians were up here. Babylonia is over here. And this empire expands to Jerusalem. And this is the one that conquers Jerusalem in 587 BCE, causing the Babylonian exile, bringing Judeans back to Babylon. Okay? And then having battles with the Egyptian Empire. Next we have Persians. Persian Empire. The biggest of them all, the Persian Empire, is Iranian. So here is Susa, here is Elam. This is modern-day Iran. The Persian Empire is Iranian, conquered Babylon. And we'll talk about this very briefly. The Persian period is important because the Persians allow the Judeans to return from Babylon to rebuild their temple. And most important, we'll see the word Persian period, Persian period, Persian period when we're talking about the editing compilation of the Torah. The prime candidate for mysterious R, who put together the Torah out of those ever mysterious sub-documents, well, we think R was active in the Persian period, i.e. the Persian Empire is in charge. So we're talking about the end of the 6th, the 5th century BCE, the 4th century BCE, 500s, 400s, 300s. Okay, that's the Persian Empire and the Persian period. The late lamented Shah of Iran wanted to reconstitute the Persian Empire. Okay, I hope that was a useful expenditure of time, just to put things in perspective. So you know, when we say Judea, you know what we're talking about. We say Jerusalem, you know where we are. We're talking about the Dead Sea, Jordan River, right? These things you should have some vague idea of where these things are. David and Solomon. We'll come to a timeline in just a moment. David and Solomon would be, according to most modern Bible scholars, would be somewhere in the 10th century BCE. 900s. Again, all these dates are approximate at best. And the larger question is, can we say anything at all about David and Solomon? But if we can, that's where they would be, the 900s. So 900s, united monarchy, right? Divided monarchy, 800s, 700s. The northern kingdom falls in 721 to the Assyrians. Southern kingdom continues to 587 when it falls to the Babylonians. Okay, these events are major events within the Bible's own conception of things. These events are referred to regularly, as we will see. So the period of Judges. There's a book in the Bible called the Book of Judges. So according to the standard, the biblical's own chronology, the Bible's own story, this is what happened. So Jacob and his sons, in the book of Genesis, Jacob and his sons go down into Egypt. Why do they go down to Egypt? Long story. We'll get there soon. They go down to Egypt. And there the offspring are enslaved by the wicked king Pharaoh. If you went to Hebrew school, it's always the wicked king Pharaoh. Right, the wicked king Pharaoh who enslaves the Israelites. The Israelites are redeemed from Egypt after much travail and much excitement. See the movie, The Ten Commandments. Right, the Israelites are redeemed, led by one Moses. They wander around in the wilderness until finally they come to the land of Israel, land of Canaan, which they conquer. That's the book of Joshua, the book which comes right after the Torah. After Joshua conquers the land of Canaan and apportions it among the tribes, then we have an interregnum called the period of Judges. That's the book of Judges, right? In which there is no king in Israel, a favorite phrase of the book. There is no king in Israel. Everybody does what he pleases. Ish kol hayashar beinav ya'aseh. Ein melech b'Yisrael, right? There's no king. There's no central authority. It's chaos. All right, that's the book of Judges. After the book of Judges, we come to the book of Samuel. In the book of Samuel, we come to the beginnings of the monarchy. That's at least the storyline of the book of Samuel. We have an aborted monarch named Saul. He is appointed king by the prophet Samuel. Things don't work out so well. Not quite sure why. Things don't work out so well until Samuel appoints David as king, and David succeeds Saul as king, and thereby founds the Davidic monarchy. Right, the royal house from the line of David. Now, if I can tell you a dirty secret, I'm not sure a word of what I just said is historically true. But I didn't say it was. I said this is a story the Bible tells. Right? There's a subject of endless debate, as we shall see, among Bible scholars, how much of what I just said is legend, how much of that is speculation, how much of that is utopianic, visionary thinking, how much of that is real. I'm not committing myself to any of that. Simply saying, so here's a timeline working on the assumption that these events are more or less true. We've gotten ourselves from the period of Judges to the United Kingdom. Who are the two kings of the United Kingdom? David and Solomon. Solomon is the son of David. Right? According to the book of Kings, Solomon is a king over a glorious empire, receiving tribute far and wide, with a harem worthy of any Near Eastern monarch, right? With a glorious palace and a glorious temple and a glorious this and a glorious that. Okay, that's the story in the book of Kings. Okay, Solomon dies, and then what happens? We have the split between the two kingdoms. Why is the kingdom split? Well, there's a storyline in the Bible, and then what modern Bible scholars say. The storyline in the Bible is that after Solomon dies, representatives of the northern tribes come to him and say, you know, your father, Solomon, he was a great king, but he taxed us terribly, and the burden was too hard to bear. Why don't you be a nice guy? Go be soft. He was hard, you be soft. So his son meets with his advisors, and the scripture points out these are all young advisors, not elderly experienced, but young advisors. And they say, no, the only way to run a kingdom is to be tough. You tell them that if Solomon was like a pinky, I'm going to be like a full waist. That means he was small, I'm going to be bigger and badder. So they said, okay, goodbye, we're out of here. Right? That's how we had the beginning of the split in the monarchy according to the Book of Kings. And you know what? That might be a true story. In other words, it sounds right, but modern scholars make up lots of other motives too. We'll talk about these things. How do they do with the temple and the monarchy? Temple, should mention that. Why does somebody remind me? Right. Solomon, of course, among the glorious things that he did was to build a temple in Jerusalem. Until that point, there was no temple. So what was there, you ask? The Israelites have been in the land of Israel now for a couple hundred years already. Why haven't they done anything? Very interesting question. Apparently they're still worshiping the Lord in some other way, some other institutional home, not a temple. Solomon is the first one who builds bricks and mortar and a roof and windows, not glass windows. It didn't have glass windows, just holes in the wall. Right, windows, right? Solomon is the first one to build a building. And probably what the northern kingdoms are also rejecting, they don't like this. That's new. That's revolutionary. We never had a building before. Why do we need a building now? Okay, coming attractions. We'll talk about all these things. So the kingdom splits. We now have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Now, if you are the author of the Book of Kings, our main source for all these things, then you have a very clear perspective on the matter. Whom has God chosen to be the king? Who is the real, authentic, genuine, royal house for the people of Israel? Is it the house of David? Or is it a bunch of pretenders, sinners, and no-goods? What's your answer, class?
House of David.
House of David. Oh, you're good. Right. The House of David. So from the perspective of the author of Book of Kings, the northern kingdom is illegitimate, corrupt, hopeless from day one, because it is founded on a rejection of the royal house appointed by God. And in addition, not just that, they make things worse because they're a bunch of idolaters. See discussion on Monday. Right. From the point of view of the Book of Kings, they're idolaters because they build cult shrines to all kinds of gods and goddesses. And they do all kinds of unspeakable things in their worship of these gods and goddesses, further enhancing their illegitimacy. Modern Bible scholars, of course, try very hard to say, well, that's the perspective of the Book of Kings. The perspective of the Northerners, apparently this was perfectly licit. They didn't have this concept of idolatry. That's the perspective of somebody writing from a very clear vantage point in the light of later theological developments, projecting back onto an earlier time. That's modern Bible scholars. So all those Israelite cultic figurines that I showed you, that's not idolatry, that's just Israelite religion. Or Israelite domestic piety, we might call it. Okay, you see how tricky these things are. Anyway, the northern kingdom comes to an end, and the author of the Book of Kings says, I told you so. I warned you this kingdom was doomed. It took a few centuries, that's true, and during that time it actually had a great period of prosperity and success. True, but let's not go there. From the point of view of the narrator of the Book of Kings, it was doomed and rotten to the core from day one. And it collapses conquered by the Assyrians, 721 BCE. The northern kingdom comes to an end. Yes. I don't know, because I'll tell you this, the author of the Book of Kings doesn't know how to do it either, right? It's extraordinarily confusing, right? So when you're reading the narratives, sometimes he has separate parallel narratives, other times these narratives intersect. For example, when they go at war with each other, either as enemies or they go to war as allies, right? The kings' lists don't line up, the years don't work. If you do the chronology of the number of kings that arrive with the parallel kingdoms, they don't line up. Something is wrong. I'm not finding fault, heaven forbid, with the author. I'm commenting, I understand his difficulty when he's trying to tell two separate stories at the same time. And no doubt he has different sources for the northern kingdom and the south, and blend them together is extremely difficult, and he's not always successful. But from the perspective of the Book of Kings, which is in our Bible, right, one of the 24 books, there's part 1 and part 2, but it's one Book of Kings. From the perspective of the narrator of the Book of Kings, the northern kingdom is inherently sinful because it is based on a rejection of the house of David. The house of David is the monarchy of David and Solomon, right? Solomon dies. the northern kingdom walks out and found the northern tribes walk out and found their own monarch, their own state. And that act of rejection of the Davidic house is tantamount to an act of rebellion against God. Exactly. In fact, the interesting thing about the northern kingdom is not only are none of the kings in the house of David, they don't have a dynastic idea. The amazing thing is in the south, the kingdom of Judah, you have the house of David, father, son, father, son, father, son. There are a couple of interruptions, a couple of bouncy, bumpy transitions in the southern kingdom, but fundamentally the dynastic ideal endures. They're all from the house of David. In the northern kingdom, there is no dynastic ideal. I think the longest series is three generations in the northern kingdom. Then it's replaced by another house. So the dynastic ideal is also rejected by the northern kingdom, interestingly enough. But that's already our modern attempt to understand what they're doing. Maybe they don't like this dynastic principle. The Davidites claim to be, we're the house chosen by God to be kings, and they're saying, who the hell are you? Yeah, but I know the different scholars argue different things. The latest thinking of Professor Frank Moore Cross, the late Frank Moore Cross of this institution, a very distinguished biblicist, was that the book of Kings belongs to a school that we call the Deuteronomical school. We'll come to that, not to worry. Don't worry if you don't know what that word is yet. And there are different layers in it. It has different periods of redaction. Depending upon the historical events, the narrative expands. So if that's correct, some of the book of Kings might even be pre-exilic, before the exile of Babylonia, before 587 BCE, right? Whereas other layers will be much later. In other words, we don't know. That's a long way of saying that we don't know, and we guess. So, that's the northern kingdom, comes to an end in 721 BCE. The not insignificant contribution of the northern kingdom to the Bible is prophecy. Our earliest prophets are from the north, and they travel south. Okay, here's the southern kingdom, which endures, so past 721, the Assyrians bump off the northern kingdom, so we have the southern kingdom which endures until 587 BCE with the Babylonian exile. Okay, the Judeans are exiled to Babylon. Okay, and here's some text. Then we have the period of exile from 587 BCE down to 538, it says. Okay, it's a fine date. 538, that's the date that the Persian Empire, Persians, where did they come from? Because the Persians in the meantime conquered the Babylonians. How about the Assyrians? No, the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians. Right, you got to keep track here, keep your scorecard out. Otherwise, every century goes by, there's another empire in town. Okay, so the Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire. And don't worry, if you don't like names and dates, we won't be doing this after today. But we do need a context. Right. So we have the exilic period, that's this. 538 BCE, the Persian Empire, which had conquered Babylon, allows the Judeans to return from Babylon, to return to Judea, and to rebuild their temple, and to reconstitute their domain. That's what we call the Persian period. The most important thing about the Persian period is that we think a lot of what we call the Bible gets written, redacted, edited, compiled, composed, put together during this time. That's just a hunch. We don't have any clear evidence for that. But the clear point is, after this period, we go to the Hellenistic period, in the 3rd and 2nd century BCE. There is no question that you have people living here who have something that is beginning to look like what we call the Bible. They have a Torah with 5 books in it. This is sacred scripture, which they're reading and studying. Right? I can see that clearly by the time you get to here. Hellenistic period, remind me. So you took high school history. Who was the founder of the Hellenistic empires? Alexander the Great. Give me a year. What year did he pick for that? 332. Fine. It's a fine year. 333, 332, 334. It depends which battle you want to pick. Right. 332 BCE. Right. That's the Alexander the Great puts an end to the Persian Empire by conquering it, and then launching what we call the Hellenistic, or sometimes called the Greek period. By this is really, technically speaking, is more or less out of our course, except for one important book, which we'll talk about a lot at the end of our course. That's here. Hellenistic period, so I won't give you the history of that because that's beyond the purview of our course, and I don't worry about information overload, right? But we have the Maccabean period. This is when the Jews of Judea rebel against the Greek, Macedonian, Hellenistic, imperialist, colonialist empire. If you went to Hebrew school, you know it's the wicked king Antiochus. Right? Went to Hebrew school, it's always wicked Antiochus, like wicked Pharaoh, just to make clear where we stand. Right. So, most importantly, this is the 160s BCE. Complicated story, again, beyond the purview of our course. But the 160s BCE, the Hasmoneans, or the Maccabees, rebel against the Greek Macedonian king, the Hellenistic kingdom, and they are successful. And they give us the festival of Lights, also known as Hanukkah. Right. So if you are Jewish kids who got presents on Hanukkah, you'd be thankful to the Maccabees. Right? That's why you got presents. And Christmas helps too. Right? But that's why you got presents on Hanukkah. The important point for our purposes is that during the middle of that crisis, when it was not clear to anybody how it was going to end, it was not clear if the Maccabees were going to be successful or they're going to be conquered, whether the temple would be doomed or whether in fact it would be restored. When it was not at all clear how things were going to end, somebody wrote a book. Or perhaps better, somebody compiled the book out of previously existing stuff and added stuff to it, and thereby created what we now call the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel is in our Bible. It is one of the 24 chosen books. And the book of Daniel is by far the latest book we have in the Bible. From the 160s BCE. Now I need to explain one quick point, then I got to get to okay. The book of Daniel does not admit that it's written in the 160s BCE. The author of the book of Daniel would have you believe that its main figure, Daniel, was alive not here, but was active back here, or even back here. So the author of Daniel wants you to think Daniel is alive in the period of the exile and then the return under the Persians. In other words, 300-400 years earlier. But we, modern Bible scholars, we know that that is not true. In other words, if you are a traditionalist Jew or Christian, you will say, yeah, Daniel goes back to the Babylonian, Persian, exilic period. But we, modern Bible scholars, know by reading the book of Daniel, that can't be. Why can't it be? Well, we'll talk about that near the end of the... I'm going to show you come back next week. Right, we'll come back and talk about that. Why are we so sure? But on this one, I, Shia Cohen, I'm completely confident. The book of Daniel was not written in the 6th century BCE. It was written in the 2nd. Which makes Daniel the latest book in the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay, that's Daniel. Then we come into the Roman period, and that's definitely well beyond our purview. We're getting close now to the origins of Christianity, period of Jesus, and the rest. Just one quick second about this. B put the 0 on the timeline just out of curiosities, or just out of convenience, so we have a BCE and then CE. But you should know, of course, there is no year 0, right? The year 0 did not exist in antiquity. Right? In fact, this whole system of counting did not exist in antiquity, but that's another discussion, right? This is invented much, much later in the early Middle Ages. But anyway, by 0, of course, we mean the birth of Jesus. Okay, but there was no year 0 in antiquity. So, quick math question for you math majors. So, from 2 BCE to 2 CE is elapsed how many years?
4.
Tricks them every time. Yes, I'll try again. From January 1st, 2 BCE to January 1st, 2 CE, or AD, it elapsed a period of how many years? 3, not 4, because there's no year 0. Okay? If you're not sure, take out your fingers and work it out. Okay? Good. This is the big timeline. Questions? Right? I know there's a lot to absorb at one time, but you have these timelines to refer to, but I will ask you that this stuff you should know. because we will be using these words routinely in class. The Babylonian period, the exilic period, the Persians, united monarchy, divided monarchy. These are terms that will come up. So just remember, you can always turn back here for reference if you're confused or not sure, right? But this stuff, simply this vocabulary you need. It's very hard to know. I know that there's a Torah collection not later than the 3rd or 2nd century BCE. Okay. I know that there's a prophets collection not later than the 1st century CE. And I know by the 1st century CE, my friend Josephus, the Jewish historian, I call him my friend because I wrote a PhD on him and I've been studying his works for 30 years or more, so I think by now I can say I'm his friend, right? The Jewish historian Josephus, right, he already knows a division into three. We count 24 books. He says there were 22 books. I wish he had said 24. But okay, he says there were 22 books, and he says there are 3 divisions. So that looks like our Bible. So by the 1st century of our era, Jews seem to have something like our Bible. I mean, our collection of books arranged more or less the way we have them. How far back that goes is a very difficult question, which is the subject of endless discussion. The case of Daniel would show that in the 2nd century BCE, there are books that are still being created that somehow can get into the Bible. Even though by then lots of books are being created that are not going into the Bible. But this whole process is hidden from us. We call this process canonization. Right? How books enter the biblical canon. But that process happens off the radar screen. There's no ancient source that describes for us how this happened. So it's not that Shia Cohen is hermeneutics of suspicion, doesn't believe what they say. There are no sources. Period. This is happening below the radar screen. The result is we don't know. Okay, about 5 minutes now to give a brief history of Israelite theology. That's not a problem. The key thing is to understand transitions, developments, and changes across time. This is one of the major points of Kugel's book also, which we'll see already next week. Namely, lots of ideas that people claim are in the Bible are not in the Bible. Lots of ideas that people find in the Bible are only there if you want them to be there. If you just read the text straight, lo and behold, it's not there. And this is particularly true. I mentioned this briefly on Monday, talking about the principle there are no other gods. Well, the Bible itself is mysteriously complicated on that subject. Similarly, the idea that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked, which is one of the key central teachings of the Hebrew Scriptures. That God is the God of nature, God is the God of history, and God uses both nature and history to see to it that the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished. Whether you believe that or not is not the point. I'm simply saying that is a teaching of the Hebrew Scriptures. But the Hebrew Scriptures already begin to show us that there are cracks in this armor. Namely, Jews themselves, Israelites themselves, realize that this principle is easy to believe in the abstract, but very hard to accept in application in detail. Because, as we all know, it doesn't seem to be true. The righteous often live a life of poverty and suffering. Why is that? And the wicked seem to prosper. Why is that? That's not a real question. That's just a rhetorical question. Right? I don't know why that is either. Right? That's one in the eternal mysteries. Right? But the Israelites themselves notice this. They notice this both on the individual level, namely Joe and Sam and Bill and Sarah and Rachel. They also noticed it on the national level. We Israelites, how come we get beaten up by these empires all the time? All right, maybe we're not so righteous, true, but what, the Assyrians are more righteous than we are? The Babylonians are more righteous than we are, God? How come they get empires and we don't? How come they get to exile us? Why do we exile them? So on both the individual level and on the national level, the Israelites themselves recognized something is wrong. The simple statement, God rewards the righteous, punishes the wicked, is inadequate. The result is, later Jews in the last centuries BC, in the Hellenistic period, I can use that term now, in the Hellenistic period, right, in the Roman period, they begin to speculate, and they argue that maybe there's something else out there that is causing this disaster. There's something else out there which explains why the righteous suffer and why the wicked prosper. What is that something else? It's some countervailing force, some dark energy, dark matter, prions, black holes, something out there, right, that is causing God's plan to go awry. But don't worry, last point, don't worry. In the end time, it'll all work out. Not here and now. Here and now is hopeless. Some other time, some future existence. That's what everything will turn out. That's what will turn out to be a foundation belief in Judaism and Christianity, but that is not in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful weekend. I look forward to seeing you on Monday.